Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to basically break down complex source material and get you up to speed fast. Today we're tackling something really interesting in negligence law. It's also paradox, isn't it?
Yeah, so our mission today, take some core legal sources and figure out this puzzle for you. How does the law decide if someone's negligent when, well, the usual standard, the reasonable person, is physically impossible for them? Think about someone who's totally blind. The average person sees. So how can the law possibly hold a blind person to, that standard?
That's exactly the tension, right? It's why we need to dive into this. We have to
Yeah.
figure out, okay, when does the law make an allowance and when does it still demand someone be careful? So here's the plan. We'll start with the bedrock principle from Professor Prosser. Then we'll really dig into it by applying that rule rigorously using that FIRAC structure to the key case, Roberts v. State, from back in '81. And by the end, we should have a really practical diagnostic framework you can use.
Okay, sounds good. Let's start broad then. We have this objective, reasonable person standard. It's supposed to keep things safe, consistent. But, if someone has a physical disability, like they're deaf or maybe missing a limb, does the law just ignore that? Does it really demand the impossible?
No, absolutely not. That's a key point. Negligence law isn't meant to be absurd. It doesn't demand impossible things. Prosser's standard, which, most places follow, makes a really critical adjustment here. When you're figuring out the standard of care, the reasonable person is basically considered identical to the actual person regarding their physical characteristics. So if the person involved is totally blind, the standard has to start from the premise that the reasonable person in that situation is also totally blind. But, and this is really crucial, while the standard gets adjusted for that physical reality, it definitely doesn't get lowered. The person's actions still have to be reasonable given their knowledge of their own impairment. Their disability is just treated as like one of the circumstances they're operating under. Essentially, they need to take the precautions that an ordinary reasonable person would take if that reasonable person were also blind.
Okay, so that completely reframes it. We're not asking, did they act like a sighted person could have? We're asking, did this person act like a reasonably careful person who knows they're blind?
Precisely. It's still an objective standard, but it's personalized to their physical condition. They have to take reasonable steps to manage the risks that come with their impairment.
Right. And that principle really sets us up for this main case we're looking at, Roberts v. State. The facts seem simple on the surface, but there's a lot going on there. We're talking about Mike Burson, totally blind. He runs a vending stand inside a post office lobby in Louisiana. And the key thing, he'd been working in that exact spot for 3.5 years. So the lawsuit happened because he was walking from his stand to the men's room, bumped into the plaintiff, and crucially, he wasn't using his cane at that moment, even though he had it nearby. The plaintiff said that was negligent. Okay, let's analyze Roberts. First, what are the legally dispositive facts? What did the court really focus on?
Right. The facts that really mattered boiled down to two main things: Burson himself, his condition, and then his environment. So yes, Mike Burson, totally blind. Critically, he'd worked at this specific post office lobby since 1974, 3.5 years in the same spot. That makes it an extremely familiar place for him. He'd also had mobility training, and he testified that for these really short trips inside the building, like this one was maybe 15 feet, he relied on something he called his facial sense. He admitted, yeah, he wasn't using his cane right then, which he did call his main tool, but he always used it for longer travel, like getting to and from work.
That term facial sense, it sounds quite technical. I imagine not everyone listening knows exactly what that means in terms of mobility training. Can you elaborate a bit on that? What was Burson actually describing?
Yeah, that's a great point. Facial sense isn't like a sixth sense or anything mystical. It's a term some blind individuals use to describe a really heightened awareness of their surroundings through non-visual means. It's about using echoes, air currents, maybe slight temperature changes, sounds, all those subtle cues to map out a very familiar space almost instantly. It relies heavily on knowing the fixed landmarks. So by mentioning it, he was showing his choice not to use the cane wasn't just random or careless. It was based on a specific trained technique suitable for that very familiar short route.
Interesting. So the core argument against him was pretty straightforward. Blind person, public area, should use a cane. Period. What exactly was the core legal issue the court had to decide?
The precise issue was this. Did Burson's choice not to use his cane while walking through that familiar post office lobby a public space? Yes, but one he knew extremely well amount to a failure to exercise the care required of a reasonably prudent blind person under those specific circumstances? Was the choice itself negligent?
Okay. And what rule did the court apply to figure that out?
They went right back to that Prosser rule we talked about. The defendant has to take the precautions an ordinary, reasonable person would take if they were blind. His disability is just one of the circumstances. So the court wasn't just looking for the absence of the cane, they were looking for actual imprudence. Did he act unreasonably as a blind person in that situation?
This is where it gets really interesting, I think. Because, if you're just thinking about it commonsensically, you might think, well, isn't the whole point of a cane to detect the unexpected, like another person suddenly being there?
Yeah.
Even if the lobby is familiar, the people in it aren't fixed. So not using it in a public lobby, even when you know well, feels inherently risky. What was the court's analysis? How did they conclude his actions were actually reasonable?
That's the crux of it. The court's analysis leaned very heavily on expert testimony about what's considered normal or customary practice within the blind community, especially for people doing that kind of job. This was key. They found Burson's decision to rely on his facial sense for that short, known walk was, quote, reasoned, not reckless, but reasoned. They had George Marsloff, who was the director of the state's Division of Blind Services. He testified that it's actually common for blind people, especially vendors in familiar spots, to use other techniques besides the cane for these short internal trips. Marsloff even estimated something like 9 out of 10 blind vendors might not use a cane for those little trips inside their known workplace. And even more striking, he explained that sometimes in certain known environments, maybe crowded ones, the cane itself could become a hazard tripping people, getting tangled. So relying on other senses could actually be safer in some specific familiar contexts.
Wow, okay. That's a huge insight. So the court's essentially saying, look, he made a trained professional judgment call based on custom and familiarity, and sometimes the default tool isn't the best tool for the specific situation.
Exactly right. This wasn't just Burson's personal quirk. It was presented as, like, an accepted practice among trained blind professionals in similar settings. Another counselor, Guy DeSherry, backed this up. Said Burson knew the building pretty well and confirmed, yeah, most operators don't use the cane for short, familiar indoor trips. Even the plaintiff's own expert, who generally pushed for cane use, had to admit that 3.5 years was definitely long enough for an environment to be considered familiar. And the court also pointed out there was zero evidence Burson was, like, rushing or not paying attention. He just happened to bump into someone in that brief walk.
So the specialized knowledge and the context won out over a general rule. And the conclusion.
The trial court had ruled in favor of Burson, the defendant. The appellate court affirmed that judgment. They said the plaintiff simply failed to prove Burson was negligent. Why? Because he acted as a reasonably prudent blind person would have acted under those very specific, highly familiar circumstances. He used his training, adapted, and wasn't careless given the situation.
The whole thing really seems to pivot on that idea of familiarity, doesn't it? Let's test that. Let's push the boundaries with a hypothetical to really cement the principle. We need something memorable. Okay, what if? What if Mike Burson hadn't been there 3.5 years? Let's say he just transferred. It's his second day working in a totally different place, maybe a huge, chaotic, unfamiliar airport terminal, a maze, people rushing everywhere, constant announcements, luggage carts, totally unknown territory. And now, same scenario otherwise. He leaves his cane behind, but this time he gets hit with sudden severe food poisoning or something. He's rushing, desperate to get to the nearest bathroom. And because he's rushing and can't see, he collides hard with the plaintiff, causing a serious injury. Does the outcome change?
Oh, absolutely. That changes everything, and it perfectly highlights the limits of the Roberts ruling. Remember the core idea. The law allows for the disability itself, the fact he can't see, but it does not excuse carelessness or ignoring known risks associated with that disability. In the real Roberts case, Burson's familiarity and his training allowed him to make a reasoned assessment that the risk of that short walk without a cane was low and that his facial sense was adequate. It was a calculated choice based on deep knowledge of the space. But in your hypothetical, totally different ballgame. The environment is brand new, it's high traffic, it's inherently unpredictable. A reasonable blind person knows that kind of environment presents a much, much higher risk. The duty is always to adjust your precautions based on the circumstances you know or should know. So, in an unfamiliar, high-risk airport, failing to use your primary safety tool, the cane, especially when you add the factor of rushing due to illness, well, that demonstrates a lack of reasonable care. He knows he's blind, he knows he's in a dangerous setting, he can't navigate safely at speed without his main tool. That conduct would almost certainly violate the rule. His actions have to be reasonable in light of his knowledge of his impairment and the situation. That switch from known, low risk to unknown, high risk. That's likely the difference between finding no negligence, like in Roberts, and finding negligence, like in the airport hypothetical.
So the standard reasonable blind person, it's not static, it's dynamic. It demands situational awareness, adapting your precautions to the context as much as it demands basic training. Okay, this is super helpful. So for you listening, if you need to analyze this kind of issue, maybe spotting it on an exam or just understanding it, we need a clear, practical process. Let's synthesize this. How should we diagnose a physical impairment case? What's the checklist?
Okay, definitely. We can break it down into a straightforward four-step diagnostic checklist. Think of this as your issue spotting guide whenever physical impairment and negligence come up. Step 1. Identify the physical impairment. First things first, you have to establish that the person involved actually has a physical characteristic, blindness, deafness, maybe something else that genuinely makes it impossible for them to meet the standard of the average reasonable person without that impairment. That's the trigger. Step 2. State the modified standard. Once you've identified the impairment, you immediately shift gears. Don't talk about the general reasonable person anymore. State the Prosser rule. The actor is held to the standard of a reasonably prudent person who has that specific physical impairment. Remember, adjusted, not lowered. Step 3. Analyze knowledge and training. This is crucial. You have to look at what this specific person knew about their own condition and what training they had. Did they have mobility training like Burson? Were they using a recognized technique like facial sense? Or were they untrained or ignoring their training? Step 4. Analyze context and precaution. This is where the case is often won or lost. Did the person take reasonable precautions considering the specific circumstances? This is where familiarity comes in. Was the environment known, like the Roberts post office, or unknown and high risk, like the airport hypo? Was traffic heavy or light? Was there urgency? And crucially, was their choice, like not using the cane and Roberts, a reasoned, defensible deviation based on things like familiarity or custom? Or was it just a careless omission in a situation that clearly demanded more caution? You're basically asking, did the level of precaution match the foreseeable risk given their impairment and the situation?
That's a really clear roadmap. Thank you. So I guess the big aha moment, pulling it all together from the sources, is that the standard of care isn't actually lowered for someone with physical disability. It's adjusted to fit their physical reality. But it still demands they use reasoned judgment and take appropriate precautions for that reality. They have to act like a reasonable blind person or a reasonable deaf person would act. And the burden is on the plaintiff to show they didn't meet that adjusted but still objective standard.
Exactly. Well put. The law tries to be fair to the reality of the impairment without sacrificing the need for reasonable care towards others. And thinking about this, how the law adjusts for a clear physical thing, like blindness, it naturally leads to another, maybe even trickier question, doesn't it? We've seen the law make a pretty rational allowance for Mike Burson's blindness. It's observable, it's physical. But what happens when the impairment isn't physical? What if it's internal, like, say, a significant mental disability or a developmental challenge? Does the law make those same kinds of allowances for conditions that aren't so easily seen or measured?
That tension between adjusting for physical limits versus maybe not adjusting for mental or internal ones, yeah, that definitely sounds like something we need to dive into next time. This has been incredibly clarifying. Thanks for walking us through the nuances here.
My pleasure. It's fascinating stuff.
And thank you for diving deep into the sources with us today. We'll catch you on the next Deep Dive.